more on Iceland's economic recovery, we're joined by Gudrun Johnsen. She's an assistant professor of finance at the University of Iceland and the author of Bringing Down the Banking System, Lessons from Iceland. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Iceland was one of the countries worst hit by the financial crisis in 2008. Its three largest banks collapsed under debt 6 times the national GDP, and Iceland went against the grain and let its banks fail. So how has Iceland's financial system been able to make this turnaround so quickly after the crisis?
Well, that's a very good question to pose, Michelle. We have to. You actually mentioned that the currency of the Icelandic currency devalued by 50%. So that had a detrimental effect to the balance sheets of both households and corporates. Now, corporates were largely funded in foreign currency, so that therefore they saw their debt skyrocket. But households also were indebted in foreign currency, but also as well in index-linked bonds. So due to the inflation that spiked after the currency dropped, households also saw a huge increase in on their liability sides of their balance sheet. So the government basically had to think outside of the box and react to these extremes.
And it certainly did react, and we've seen the economy thrive. Exports are up, the financial system is back on track. What have been the big drivers of this remarkable growth that we've seen?
So I think that, you know, for large degree, it has been a private and public cooperation getting the economy back on track. First, we need to mention the policymakers' courage to basically incentivize the bankers to write off bad debt. A program was set in place both for corporates and in households. For example, household debt that were mortgages that exceeded 110% of the market value of the home was considered unsustainable. So that put the bankers in a place where they needed to act quickly and restructure the loan books of their own and restructure the debt of the households and corporates. Now, you remember also from where we're coming from, the central bank went technically bankrupt. So the state had to issue a bond of 60% of that year's budget only to refund the central bank, let alone the rest of the financial sector. Now, what has really helped us, or this in particular has really helped us, the writing of bad debt fairly quickly. So we have gone through a complete credit cycle, if you will, from 100% of GDP bank credit to the private sector up to 350%, down again in 2014 to 100% of GDP. So I think that contributed a whole lot to the turnaround.
Well, those extreme measures certainly did prove to be dramatic yet effective in the long run. You mentioned that the krona was devalued up to 50%. Now, that helped make tourism more attractive. Before the crisis, Iceland had about 500,000 foreign visitors every year. Last year was 1.5 million people. So how has the tourism sector been able to basically triple over this time?
Yeah, that's a good question. All publicity is good publicity, as they say in marketing. So I think that Iceland was fortunate enough in many cases in all this during this calamity that the eyes of the world basically turned to Iceland, both because of the financial crash as well as infamous eruptions that we had in one of our volcanoes at a very, very sensitive time. So the government also restrained from taking back tax incentives for the film industry. That's one. So we've had great shows come to Iceland to shoot their films, as well as TV shows. So that has opened the eyes of the rest of the world to the beauty of Iceland.
Well, you mentioned films and film incentives. Game of Thrones, incredibly popular show shot in Iceland, as we mentioned. What effect has that had on the economy?
I think definitely that has had a big role. Also, the movies that have been shooting in Iceland have been promoting the scenery in Iceland and the hospitality of the country. So I think that played a huge role. But let's not forget, we are a fishing industry or nation of fishermen, and we also had at a very vulnerable point the mackerel fish stock swimming into our waters, and that for a small economy like Iceland with 300,000 people, that actually counted towards our recovery as well.
Well, as we said, this recovery has been incredibly impressive. GDP up 4.2% in this first quarter. You wrote a book about this. What would you say is the main lesson that can be learned from Iceland's economic recovery?
Oh, Michelle, there are so many lessons, and to be honest, I come back again to how we elect our political leaders. We have to be really careful to set up laws that refrain people from acting on conflicts of interest, things like that have helped in the recovery stage. And then there are the lessons for trying to prevent things like that happened in Iceland in 2008, and that is a whole different set of lessons to be learned.
Well, leadership, certainly very important. And Iceland's former president had said that Britain, now that it's voted to leave the EU, can join a triangle of countries in the Northern Atlantic which do not belong to the EU. What impact do you think the Brexit will have on Iceland?
Well, Icelanders have actually been a little bit hesitant to enter the EU. There is a big political debate, or was a big political debate right after the crash, but that has sort of, with the European debt crisis, that has dampened quite a bit. So I think the Brexit will not have a big impact on the minds of the voting public on whether to enter into the EU. Obviously, we are a nation with a tiny currency that will be vulnerable. So time will only tell whether our leaders, after having sort of cleaned up after the big calamities of 2008, for example, alleviating capital controls completely, then we will probably address this question again, whether to enter the EU.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for your insight, Gudrun Johnsen, Assistant Professor of Finance at the University of Iceland and author of Bringing Down the Banking System, Lessons from Iceland.